Thank you, Robert. So I'm faced tonight with the impossible task of introducing Martin Manalansan. I could begin, I suppose, by saying that Martin has, for quite some time now, been at the forefront of queer studies, Filipino and Filipina diaspora studies, and the intersections of this field. Indeed, the conversations that have happened today, represented by the many times people have said the phrase, quote, as Martin Manalansan argues, have been undoubtedly influenced by Martin's scholarship, which has drawn attention to, made space for, and reminded us of the importance of queer intimacies, affects, lives, and communities in books like the prize-winning Global Divas, anthologies like Cultural Compass, Queer Globalizations, and Eating Asian America, not to mention numerous essays. In his more current work, Martin explores the ethical and embodied dimensions of the lives and struggles of undocumented queer immigrants, Asian American immigrant culinary cultures, sensory and affective dimensions of race and difference, and Filipino return migration. But, and I have to say this, Martin's impact is also illustrated by the many scholars who have been supported, mentored, taught, and inspired by him. His influence radiates outward to those with expertise in areas that include anthropology, gender and sexuality studies, Asian American and Filipino studies, American studies, history, literature, cultural studies, performance studies, and diaspora studies. Working in, out of, and across disciplines, his scholarship and mentoring crosses borders well beyond his departmental affiliations in anthropology, Asian American studies, gender and women's studies, to name just a few at the University of Illinois. Martin Manalansan reminds us again and again of the importance of our work on the page, in the classroom, and in the community. He challenges us to recognize the emotions, textures, performances, messes, and precarious forms of existence that refuse the bounds of the normative. And he does all of this somehow while finding the time to encourage new and emerging voices in the fields. Perhaps the best way then to fulfill this impossible task of introduction is to end with this. He is the perfect way to close this groundbreaking event. Please join me in welcoming Martin Manalansan.
Every time someone says I'm a mentor, I feel older than I usually feel. And every time someone says Dr. Manalansan, I think of my father, who was a veterinarian. And so today I just wanted to kind of just reflect on the kinds of issues, being the culminating, if you will, before the cocktails, to remind you before you have your cocktail about what transpired and kind of think through some of the main issues. There are a lot of them, and I can only at least kind of highlight some of them, right? So let me begin with, in a language that I'm pretty familiar with. So as greeting, I would say, if I were to start, I would say, mabuhay mga te, kuya at mga iba pa. Magandang gabi mga katropa sa pananampalataya. Super bonggels ang pagkadyosa ninyo, right? So I would imagine the second thing you would say is translation. And here it is. Good evening, welcome big sisters, big brothers, and others. Good evening, partners in the faith. You are all very super goddess-like beautiful. And I think the translation misses a lot, right? The fabulousness drops off, if you will. But I think one of the things that this conference today has brought about is really the fragility and the tenuousness of translation, the ways in which there are these tensions between categories, like when the question around Kim about transgender, right? The tensions that, how do you negotiate between these categories? And so what I wanted to do is to highlight those things as a way to end this wonderful day, this fabulous day. And I know that you might be a little confused by the addition of that title, which is not in the program, which is Sashay Away. So most people who know, Sashay Away is from RuPaul's iconic and popular competition called Drag Race. And in every episode, the culminating, if you will, like this time, the culminating event in the competition of each episode is when someone is told that they have been eliminated. And RuPaul, in her fabulous and quite elegant way, would say, you know, you need to go. You need to sashay, and now sashay away, right? So one of the things I'm really interested in is to think about that moment when someone is told to sashay away. And most people know that it doesn't happen, it doesn't end after the losing contestant, if you will, leaves the stage. Typically, there is that additional scene of the eliminated contestant going to the dressing room and writing something on the wall, right? In most cases, this moment of what most people would think as a rather sad moment or performance of defeat or loss is transformed into a turning point, an opportunity to move, if you will, or more appropriately, sashay into a future. Right? More often than not, the queen is often heard, and it's always this kind of, you know, I will move on, right? That I will, you know, I have learned, I have become richer for this experience, and I will move on. So I'd like to think about that in terms of the loss in the competition transformed as a pivot or a fulcrum for mobilizing energies towards what is foreseen to be a fabulous future. I totally believe in that. I believe that we had today in this conference, in terms of the conversations, presentations, the films, and the film clips, if you know, the beautiful film by Patrick, are pivotal moments that will enable us to move to a bright, capacious, and fabulous future. Again, in the ways in which Roland started the day when he said that the conference is really an arrival for new departures, right? I think that's a good way of saying it, that it's never just you have arrived and that's it, right? But one thing that I think you might be noticing is rather my rather unbridled fetish for the word fabulous. Or more specifically, one of the things in the title that you have is fabulosity, right? So fabulous to me is, you know, it's like a pronoun. It's or an article. It actually not only punctuate the way I think about things. It's always there. But fabulosity is quite interesting, and I think I've said this in my previous talks. Fabulosity is actually a trademarked brand. Yeah? You didn't know that? Kimora Lee Simmons is the legal owner of the trademark Fabulosity. So you have to be careful. I have to be careful. Because she, in Baby Fat, which is her brand, she has a Fabulosity line of products, including a book, which you can buy on Amazon for, I think, $5. Fabulosity, what it is, how to get it. It's, I think it's a bestseller. So one of the things that's really fascinating about Fabulosity is that it's not so much its branding, but rather Kimora Lee Simmons' attempt to make it as part of women's empowerment, which, you know, I would take and agree with. But then I don't think of Fabulosity as a set of accoutrements from Prada or Gucci. Fabulosity is not an elitist thing, but rather is a set of narratives or a practice of telling a story. So if you look at the etymology of fabulous, fabulosity, you have fabula, which is a story, a tale, a fable. And one of the things I wanted to point out today are the stories that we have told during the past several hours in this conference are fabulous stories, but they're not in the way we think of fabulous as, containing all this elegant, elite accoutrements, the fashion, all. There's a little bit of that, but I think one thing that is precisely interesting at my own conception of fabulous in relation to Filipino queers, is that fabulous is a narrative that contains, these moments of exuberance, right, of joy and pleasure that rubs against in a kind of frictive relationship, in a kind of friction with pathos, with violence, with death, right? That one can think of fabulous in this seemingly contradictory way. And allow me to kind of think more about that, or kind of sift through that. I'd like to kind of point out, for instance, that moment when Augusto in Patrick's film donned the Vegas showgirl costume. That she did that, or he did that, right? I'm thinking he would use the word, the male pronoun, that he would have done that in the midst of the story, the longer and longer story of dispossession and violence against the Atis. And I'm kind of culling from what I just seen from the film, is that precisely the fabulousness of Augusto, it happens with and despite the kinds of violence, dispossession, and inequality that you see, the blatant inequality that you see between him and the other elite families and the more, if you will, poorer, dispossessed Atis, right? The other thing that I wanted to kind of mention is that this fabulousness isn't just this kind of neat, construction of antipodal poles, of opposites, if you will, of exuberance on the one hand, and of pathos on the other. I'm thinking of fabulousness in terms of how I conceptualize queer, and I think Robert mentioned that earlier when he was talking about messiness. And what is precisely at the heart of queer isn't so much, same-sex or sexual object choice, if you will, or someone acting flamboyant, but that flamboyance or whatever it is that is happening, be it, a high-pitched voice, a masculine tone, if you will, a butch appearance, is precisely what is at the heart of this queering is a messing up, right? And I take this notion of queer as mess, or queering as a messing up or a funking up from the canonical book, Fear of a Queer Planet by Michael Warner, right? Edited by Michael Warner. And Warner, in his introduction, saw the promise of queer studies and queer theory as a kind of funking up, a kind of sensorial morass that he wanted to, that it enabled a kind of explosion, a reeking of sexual rut in the rather staid halls of academia, right? So one thing that he's proposing is precisely a notion of queer that is not just a disruption, it is this kind of almost visceral, sensorial experience. That once the thing that you see when you see Augusto, for instance, it's not just him, you're not just passively seeing him in a Las Vegas showgirl outfit. You're actually, there is this creation of an affective energy of you saying, that is either beautiful or that is a hot mess, right? And I think, let me just talk a little bit about hot messes, because I love hot messes. Hot messes are actually quite productive conceptually and theoretically. Can anyone mention an iconic hot mess in popular culture? Hot mess. Lindsay Lohan. Iconic. One more.
Amy Winehouse.
Amy Winehouse. Right? So one of the things that's really fascinating about hot messes is not the fact that we just say, oh, hot mess, and then we leave it at that. We keep turning back, right? It's never just we're repelled by it, but we're also attracted to it, right? This kind of seemingly antipolar reaction is at the heart of queer, right? That most people might think, oh, hot messes are hopeless. But I think this is precisely what I'm trying to kind of point out, is to think in terms of these impossible moments, right? Let me give you a very good example. I've said it at my talk, University of Toronto, about 2 years ago. Because my other obsession is the reality show Hoarders Buried Alive. Do people know Hoarders?
Oh, yeah.
Right? So the typical hoarding TV show is about someone who is a hoarder, meaning their home, their domestic space, is in chaos, right? So the typical scene is someone flows in, typically a friend or a family member who has not been to the apartment or house, and the first thing that comes out of their mouths, right? You know, including being open mouthed and in shock, they'll say, "How can you live like this?" Right? And it's precisely this kind of impossibility that is at the heart of queer, right? Queer is like that cannot be, that should not be, right? That is impossible. So that it's what I'm trying to kind of point out is that this impossibility is in fact a pivot rather than an endpoint, right? That impossibility becomes a way of thinking through what can be or what can be done. However, in the reality show, the impossibility is turned into the story of normalization, right? What happens? They get a professional organizer, a therapist, right? And movers, right? Professional cleaners. So in fact, what you find is the story of hoarders is really a story of becoming normal, of becoming acceptable, right? But what if we think of, queerness and mess as something that is not supposed to be cleaned up, but rather something that needs to be used not as a way to, not as a stepping stone towards normality, but rather something that is productive as it is, right? So one of the things that I think is crucial in trying to think of what has happened today is in a couple of panels, for instance, backing out in the panel. So in several, what I found in several of the panels that actually speak to each other is that there are these tensions between, for instance, bakla and gay, right? Or bakla and transgender. And most people would say, the first thing that most people say is, why can't there just be, in the same way as most people think translation is a one-to-one correspondence, why people would say, well, why can't there just be a kind of clean, a clean juxtaposition of bakla equals gay, right? Because most people, and I think at the heart of the, most people's discomfort, right? And I think this is precisely something that we need to cultivate, not remove. This sense of discomfort when people say, well, what are you? Are you transgender? Are you bakla? You have to make a choice. Why is that? What is the cause of that discomfort? It's precisely because what you're confronted is a mess, right? The mess of categories. It is not, they're not easily contained. And in the lives of Filipino queers, particularly as a post-colonial society in the Philippines, of immigrants in Canada and in the US, what you're confronted really is the mess of categories, right? And so one of the things that people might say is that, well, most conservative commentators and social theorists would say the correct answer or the correct solution would be integration, right? Which is just another word for assimilation, right? And so one thing that's really bothersome about that is integrate to what and on whose terms. So that's something that we need to kind of be thinking about. That even at a moment of discomfort, the impulse should not be, well, you need to assimilate, you need to clean up, right? You need to remove the mess. But rather think about what are these productive tensions, these productive discomforts that are at the heart of this, right? And I think what the panels today have really shown the different ways in which there are these tensions between, the kinds of aspirations that people have about social justice, right? And the different interests that people who are, as one panel on the aging, if you will, queer gay population or bakla population in Canada. This all has a lot to do with, well, what do you do with these with these tensions around around what needs to be done in terms of these opposing categories. So I'd like to go back to, as a way of thinking about this, I'd like to go back to Roland's initial keynote, the opening keynote, that what we have here really isn't so much a problem that needs to be solved in terms of a cleaning up, but rather a recognition that this is what it is, and not to kind of think, well, this is a problem that needs to be swept away, right? So sometimes tensions are there, right? One thing that I'm thinking about, and I know there's all this, I've been just lived, there's 6 people who live in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City, right? Think it's a New York City apartment, and how, already that's pretty much small in relation to the kind of, spatial metrics you might have in your mind, right? And how this, in my own way of being uncomfortable in dealing with them. So what do? Do I just sweep that away, or do I just say, this is what it is? And what does that mean that we are uncomfortable, right? It is about creating these contexts and appreciating this context and affirming these contexts in which these kinds of discomfort, these chaos, sensorial morass happen, right? I went into their apartments, and the first thing that comes out of my mouth is again, 6 people living in one apartment. I said, they're hoarders. But they're not, right? But even if they were, so what? And so one thing that might be, one thing that might come to, sorry, not it yet. So one thing that I wanted to kind of point to then, as a way of summing up, is that queer diasporic life, right, is full of these tensions and discomfort and messes. And one thing that we need to do is to kind of think more creatively about confronting them without dealing with them in terms of a kind of cleaning up and a kind of normalization or a normalizing, right? Because at the heart of this, people will say, well, you know, message should be these. I remember there was one reaction to my talk in one other way. They said, but messes need to be cleaned up. Right? You know, you have a mess, you clean it up. Don't you hear that? Things like just your mom, you messed up, you clean it up. But sometimes messes are not, should not be cleaned up, right? Because it's precisely, and I think it goes back to the, you know, the talk that we just heard earlier with Robert. It is the messiness of everyday life that propel us, right? That move us. Most people might think the reason why we get through life is because everything is in order. Everything is in its proper place, right? And actually, what a lot of the papers today have shown is precisely how things are not in their proper order. And you need to think of how people survive and are resilient despite the fact that these are things are messy and in a kind of chaos, you know, from afar. So what am I proposing? It's a queer vantage that sees these kinds of situations as something productive and something that need not be cleaned up. If they become the context in which we can understand people's lives, particularly those who are queer, immigrant subjects, right? So as a way of closing, I'd like to echo JP's earlier remark about that's Jennifer Louding, right? And I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit for just a couple of minutes and then I'll wrap up. When I showed that picture to people, they said, oh my God, she's so beautiful. But what a mess, right? They say, she's so beautiful, how can that be? Like she had such a tragic end to her. I don't know if you know how she was killed. She drowned in a toilet bowl. She was strangled and then her head was shoved into the toilet bowl. And because it really, people said, it's such a mess. Okay? But then as JP was kind of telling us, this is a kind of tragedy that will haunt us in a way that I think should propel us, right? And help us move. So here, and I think one of the things that I've been hearing also throughout the day is the idea of moving, of being mobile, of movements, right? And here I was thinking of you know, how Filipinos, sometimes Filipinos have been accused of being overly physical, you know, judgmental in terms of physical attributes, right? I don't know, there might be other cultures that would greet you saying, you're so fat. If they haven't seen you, they'll say, oh God, you've gotten fat. That's a greeting. I'm not, you know, Filipinos will testify to the fact that it's actually seen as a normal greeting for people to say, oh God, you're so fat. Or, oh, you're so beautiful, you're so thin, right? But to me, to me, the idea of juxtaposing the beautiful, the tragic, and the mess is precisely at the heart of this kind of queer situation, right? That needs to be, because people, you know, people say, oh my God, no, you know, if someone actually did tell me that, oh my God, if she was ugly, I would say, oh, that's too bad, but turn away. But because she was beautiful, right? There's this idea, it almost becomes like Lindsay Lohan going, oh my God, she's such a hot mess, but I need to go back. And I'm thinking of the ways in which this kind of tension between attraction and repulsion, this kind of the idea of mess, a mess that needs to be cleaned up, might be turned around in terms of a more critical queer analysis. to think of, again, as JP was saying in his essay, to think of, longer histories, much longer histories of militarism, colonialism, and capitalism in terms of poverty. She was working as a sex worker, right? And so, as a way of concluding, it might seem, and I think to some people, to end with Jennifer Laude, and I think JP and I are ending with Jennifer Laude among other things, who was brutally murdered by a U.S. Marine private, might not be the most, I would say, comfortable ending to a conference like this, right? That people say, what would a tragedy in the Philippines have to do with us gathered here in North America, in Canada? What might be seen as an isolated tragic crime thousands of miles away might have very little relevance, according to some people, to what we want to do today. But but we need to take heed that in this era of globalization, the long history of colonialism and militarization, we are not becoming McDonaldized, meaning we're not becoming similar, but rather we are, whether we want it or not, connected, right? And it's this kind of connection, however uncomfortable that might be, right? It's something that we need to recognize and to affirm and to utilize. This uncomfortable proximity or intimacy with Jennifer Laude, the hot mess that some people think that she is precisely at the heart of our, the heart of what we need to confront today. Forged not just by a proliferation of global capital, but rather, as I said earlier, a much longer history of colonialism, Western expansion in what is now the global South. So we need to tell her story among our other stories, right? It is, as I said earlier, to tell a story is to be fabulous, but this fabulous story is etched in and in a kind of frictive relationship with the tragic and with the messy, right? This tragedy should animate and enliven the kind of vibrant cultural and political and scholarly activism and dialogue that we have just started here. So death, mess, and discomfort may not be, as I said, the proper topic of an ending keynote. But rather than seeing mourning or tragedy as helplessness, inaction, or loss, we should see our anger and our mourning as products of our own search for injustice, right? I'm sorry, search for justice, not injustice. Search for justice, that it become the pivot that will propel our conversation, the energies and capacities that have been produced today, as the weaving of stories as something that is not finished, that needs to continue, that needs to expand and include more people, more agendas, more issues in different times and places. Our future, our politics, need to be capacious and broad-ranging, as several people have said, and actually testified in all of the various progressive agendas that have been presented today. Even as we think of and engage with Canada, we need to think beyond our own temporal and geographic borders. On that note, let us continue, again, telling our stories with a critical eye, a flirty stance, brimming with hopeful aspirations toward that horizon of justice, of that, towards some kind of communal spirit. We need to move into our future with fervor, with dynamic energy, with fierceness, and we need to do it with love, with beauty, and of course, with fabulosity. Thank you, good night, and now sashay away.
Thank you, Dr. Manalansan, for the wonderful keynote, for describing the excesses and the fabulousness and, of course, the messiness of queer diasporic studies as it relates to the Filipino and Filipina communities. At this point, moving forward, I'm going to invite JP to come back over here, and Martin, if you could, we'll just take 2 questions. In closing. So we'll start with taking the 2 questions, and then perhaps you can address the 2 questions together.
Where did Robert go?
Robert, yeah. So unfortunately, we'll have to move forward without Robert. Would anyone like to ask a question? We'll just take the 2 questions.
Spanish and Americans continue to kill transhuman people from our islands, and how that's a very specific thing that that reaches globally. So I don't know. I'm just getting super emotional about it because I'm just interested about the use of words like necropolitics, the use of death, and what it means to me also. Observing a conference where I've not seen like trans speaking about their own narratives here and their own work, which I know that there are more scholars who would discuss trans misogyny as it relates to colonialism. So, well, the question is, so I mean, I guess, how does necropolitics work within the frameworks that you discussed in queerness, in the way that queerness relates to death and life, and how the living use the dead, and what that means both in academia and in religions? Oh, I just came up with that, sorry.
Go ahead. Well,
should we just take, sorry JP,
sure,
should we just take
absolutely.
one more question, and then you could answer both of them simultaneously at the same time?
Sure.
So this is the last question.
You're thinner. And for a long time, I didn't know what to make of it, and I finally decided that what actually it is a greeting that says, I see you. And so this question of seeing someone, really seeing them, and all the fabulosity and all the messiness, makes me think about this question of how we ended with how stories are fabulous, but stories are also about tragedy, about violence. They're about histories of colonization, all the way back to the Americas, to the first Cubans rape and genocide of indigenous women on this continent.
Yeah.
And this way in which history, which is sort of my field, indigenous presence, but in particular indigenous women, are made absent from history. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about whether there's a productive and messy connection between these deep histories of indigenous violence in the Americas and the, of course, the thing that's happening in Canada right now around the incredible murder of an incredible number of Indigenous women is a question, and then being absent from history the same way is how you declare presence as transgender, as queer, as opposed to the way history and culture wants to not see.
Yeah.
Make you absent.
Let me just do something real quick. It's because I'm always fascinated by how the spectacular really is, as you're saying, is not just about that which is so flashy and that you're so almost blinded by its spectacularness or fabulosity, if you will, but also something that is left out and something that is missing, right? Because, you know, watching Patrick's film today, you know, even as he was trying to narrate different groups of people, Augusto, you know, seeing him, I guess I'm seeing him from, you know, a more critical queer lens, is, you know, seeing him being able to walk the street and being able to buy those things is premised on the fact that you have the Atis, the indigenous people, who are almost close to death or, you know, kind of striving to not die, right? And on the one hand, I think the spectacular and the fabulous, at least the more flashy fabulousness that most people are used to, are really about a kind of deflection from, you know, that which is missing. But a queer lens is precisely, and I guess this has to do with necropolitics, is that even at a moment when you're seeing something, you're also seeing that which is not there, that which you're unable to see, or, and so, to me, you know, visuality, I think, is also an overprivileged sensorial regime, because one of the things that that I've realized talking to people who lived in cramped places, right, is they, you know, the 6 people lived in these very cramped areas. There's a lot of things that they know is there, but they cannot see it because it's so crammed together, right? That the discomfort that most people have is precisely, there are just too many things that you cannot see. It's not, you know, you come in and everything is in its proper place. But a critical queer lens is precisely when you see something, you do more than see what is in front of you, but also to see or sense, right? Maybe haptic, maybe, you know, through olfactory sense or whatever, things that are not readily available to you visually, right? Talking to people in cramped places have taught me to kind of really appreciate the limitations of the visual, right? And so most people, you know, I think there's something about the tensions and debates about gender, like what kind of pronoun should you use for this person that you just saw and you think is a woman, right? I think precisely a queer lens is, a queer lens allows you to kind of think in terms of how what you see is not necessarily everything that is there, right? And so, just to go back to the whole idea of those who are missing or those who have been terrorized or violated and all that. I think that if one were to, especially when you go to the global south, right, to the Philippines, that a moment of fabulousness is always like, you know, the reason why Imelda, not Imelda the poor Ati, but Imelda Marcos, right, is such a powerful thing is because they were able to ideologically at least the regime of Marcos were able to ideologically manipulate. It's like, this is it. It's all fabulous, and that is it, right? And not see the fact that, for instance, all of these opulence that is being presented to them hide the kind of misery and death that have occurred, right? Does that make sense? So, so to me, one thing that this project, I'm sorry, I'll wrap it up, that this project has taught me is to, and it's actually the people in the 6 people, I call them the queer 6. There are 6 unrelated queer immigrants from Latin America, 2 people from India, 1 Filipina trans woman whose, again, name is Imelda for her. She wanted to say, yeah, use my name, Imelda, is precisely the ways in which they are able to negotiate the crampedness, the discomfort, and to say, you know, sometimes they say, well, I can't have sex here, right? And that they need to be deaf to their desires, for instance, or that someone is snoring, that they need to, you know, turn off their, or at least kind of try not to hear, right? And so one of the things that I think this project has taught me is to think of the productive qualities of people who live in messy situations, who deal with mess in everyday life that they cannot clean up, right? They keep, you know, it's not that they're dirty people or untidy, it's just the fact that it's the weight of living, right, in a cramped place of people who are dispossessed, right? But just one last thing. I think of necropolitics, and I'm dissatisfied with necropolitics. You know, Agamben and all these people, is that they lack the fleshiness of life, right? And what I'm trying to do of everyday life, right? It bare life to me, and the way it's theorized, becomes almost very sterile, if one can say that, right? The way bare life and necropolitics is presented to us, it's as if it's sterile, but in fact, it is so messy, right? But at the same time, the messiness that is there is also the same kind of counterforce. It is an animating force rather than it's completely dead, right? So to me, one thing that I'm trying to kind of point to, that there are people who live with and despite these kinds of messy, impossible situations, right? That people like Achille Mbembe and Agamben will say, they're dead, right? They're dead. But they are, in fact, in their everyday lives, alive in so many different, in so many different ways. Sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. That was actually a good, that's a good foil to what I'm going to say. That gave me the opportunity to gather my thoughts around how I've found necropolitics as a term, as a politics, as an ethics productive. The people that have kind of shaped the way that I think about necropolitics, and of course it's kind of juxtaposed to biopolitics, right? Like the kind of the life-giving, the giving life, the organization of life as a kind of new mode of governance. It's a kind of corrective to the fact that that only applies to certain people and not others. And so I'm thinking here of the work of Achille Mbembe, but also some of the queerer formulations of necropolitics to be found in the work of people like Jin Harita Warren at York University. Fantastic kind of book. And Jin's collaborators as well, whose names I'm forgetting, and I seek forgiveness for that. One of the things that I really appreciate about necropolitics as a kind of frame is the ways that the lives of some depend on the death of others. And I hope I have signaled in my work the ways that, in this case, the vitality and, you know, the vita and vitality is the life, relies on the deaths or bare life, making barely alive some people. So whether that's poverty is juxtaposed to the kind of opulent richness of the global city in a space like New York, or the kind of sheer racialized, gendered economic inequality that characterized January and Jennifer's lives vis-a-vis where they live, right? Like Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, Olongapo City as global spaces are spaces that are rife with necropolitical inequalities where some are really alive and some are barely alive. And some of those barely alive often or sometimes even die as a result of bodily violence. So what does that then mean for us to invoke the lives, or in this case, the deaths of people and the work that they do? I think it is an ethical call for us to not consume their stories as such, but to put them into action towards a socially just future. Yeah. And I hope that the analysis that I have offered today and some of the other analysis is a kind of ethical response to the social conditions, geopolitical conditions, gender, sexuality, race, etc., that organize necropolitics as it is. And so, of course, this is not the only or even the most important site in which to do this political work, but it is one. And it is one that has prominence partly because of the social capital that is accrued in institutions like this and gatherings like this, especially. And so it's hopefully a way to mobilize resources that are available and the visibilities that are possible as a result of what might be here and what we might have to offer. So I hope that gets us started in terms of thinking about the ethical in the work that we do.
Yeah.
Thank you, JP and Martin. I am sure that there are many more questions. Let us continue the conversation at Open Gallery. Thank you to all the panelists, to our keynotes, Roland and Martin. And thank you to all of you for participating in today's groundbreaking conference. But let's continue this at Open Gallery. It's just at 49 McCall Street, just down the street towards Queen Street. There will be